On this week's episode of Devil's Trap Podcast, we're going to talk Season 5, Episode 1, and the big question, did Lucifer come?
And we're putting out a call. Where are St. Elizabeth's nipples? Let's do this. On this week's episode of Devil's Trap Podcast, it's war!
Damn right it is.
Well, also you can find out what specials are going to be available in the Haunted Home Shopping Network.
And showtime for the meat suits. Let's do this. On this week's episode of Devil's Trap Podcast, we'll talk about what do you bring to a demon block party?
And Cat Sanus.
And Sinner in the Streets, Pound Underground.
And Cat Sanus. Let's do this. Oh, on this week's episode of Devil's Trap Podcast, we discussed that time travel is still stupid.
Satan rolls in with his posse, and angels yeeted.
Also, this is what happens when you Google sex cults. Let's do this. On this week's episode of Devil's Trap Podcast, let's make wax museums hip again.
And thanks, Paris. That's hot.
And do you want to be tickled? To death? Let's do this.
Well, I think we roll with that one. On this week's episode of Devil's Trap Podcast, we've got a supernatural TV guide. First up, Travel Channel, Surfing Adventures with Jesse.
On Food Network, will the demon taco truck pull ahead in the Great Food Truck Race?
And contestants in Making the Cut have to make the best FBI outfits.
And finally, on Lifetime, Misha Collins, My Life as the Antichrist. Let's do this.
On this week's episode of Devil's Trap Podcast, we learn that you can't get into Son of Art's Goth Club without goat horns and a girdle.
Also, getting old sucks. Let's do this.
This week's episode of Devil's Trap Podcast. If you see an octopus on a snack label, is it the flavor or the mascot? You take the risk.
And what did Daddy do when you ran off and joined the pagans? Let's do this. On this week's episode of Devil's Trap Podcast, we will take you to Becky Rosen's School of Flirting.
And Liz did not warn me about ghost children.
You can hear my delightful recipe for a yellow-eyed chiller.
And good news, you can't catch the Croatone STI. Let's do this.
On this week's episode of Devil's Trap Podcast, we're going to ask some very important questions like, was Dante hot?
And, hey Death, hey!
And Diana had a rough time with the Hellhound quiz. How will you do? Let's do this.
On this week's episode of Devil's Trap Podcast, we've got Wraiths drinking brain juice like it's Grey Goose.
And help us name Batty. Batty needs a name. Leave your name in the comments or wherever. DM Diana, call her, text her, do whatever you want to do. All Diana. Diana needs Batty's name. Seriously, Batty needs a name. Let's do this. On this week's episode of Devil's Trap Podcast, we bring you Love After Lockup, the Witch Edition.
And Sam has to tussle with some thick, with two C's, thick-ass ropes.
Happy Halloween!
Let's do this. This week on Devil's Trap Podcast, we've got the lineup coming this fall to the Supernatural Network, the newest game show, 6 Degrees of Heaven Bacon.
And catch our new dating reality show, Hungry for a Winchester.
Find your supernatural dream home on Zillow.
And could you survive inside the world's toughest prison? Angel Prison. Let's do this.
On this week's episode of Devil's Trap Podcast, we're talking Season 5, Episode 14. And we ask in our newest quiz, is Cupid stupid?
We also question, are you casting an incantation? Or are you just naming anime characters?
And the newest app to launch, Demon Dash, Souls on Demand.
And finally, we also learned that Famine rides a big black steed. That's just a rascal. Let's do this. On this week's episode of Devil's Trap Podcast, Death rides a steed. Again. But this time it's a unicorn.
And are you Thanksgiving ready with Karen Singer's Zombie Pies?
Damn it, Bobby. Let's do this.
On this week's episode of Devil's Trap Podcast, we discuss the new voice for GPS, Castiel. Just follow the road. Just follow the road. Just follow the road.
And also, what happened to the dog, man? What happened to the dog?
Mr. Bones. And a new Maury's Special, God Edition. Yes, you are the father. Yes, you are the father. Yes, you are the father. Happy Thanksgiving.
Let's do this. On this week's episode of Devil's Trap Podcast, we'll discuss how do you hide your wood?
And boo, you whore of Babylon. Let's do this.
On this week's episode of Devil's Trap Podcast, we will talk about the world's greatest superpower, the ability to flap away from uncomfortable situations.
And this episode asks, will he say yes to the vest? Oh. Let's do this.
How about this? On this week's episode of Devil's Trap Podcast, it's Lore of Palooza!
And it's our 100th episode of Devil's Trap Podcast.
I'm making 1 0 zeros. That's what I'm doing. Yeah, we see it. Woo!
Ones and zeros.
Air horns, air horns, air horns.
Let's do this.
On this week's episode of Devil's Trap Podcast, Take the quiz. Is it a pharmaceutical company, a drug, or a demon?
And are you ready for Christmas? What's in your Devil's Trap sack? Merry Christmas.
Happy holidays. Meh.
Let's do this. On this week's episode of Devil's Trap Podcast, Death rides a badass Cadillac.
And everyone is making this one New Year's resolution for 2023. Don't be a dick. Let's do this. On this week's episode of Devil's Trap Podcast, those boys have finally learned what to do with their dick Lucifer. To the Winchesters out there getting possessed, to stop the apocalypse, just follow these steps. Step 1.
Find out there's a box.
Step 2.
Get the rings for that box.
Step 3.
Sam jumps in the box.
And that's the way you do it.
Dick in a box.